Hello, everyone. Welcome to the episode of AWS for Retail and CPG Insights series. I'm Sujata, Solutions Architect at AWS, and today we are exploring how retail and CPG companies are transforming their supply chain to meet the rapidly changing customer expectations. As we know, the retail world is changing very fast, and the retailers and the consumer goods companies, they are facing the real challenges in today's market, right from product shortages in shelves to delivery delays, dealing with the rising transportation cost, predicting the customer demand, and of course, the growing pressure of operating sustainably. So today I'm very excited to welcome John McFall, CEO of Supply Chain Wise, one of our valued AWS partner. John and his team have been doing some amazing work helping the retail and CPG companies tackle these supply chain challenges with innovative solutions. So John, thank you so much for joining us today. So before we dive deeper, could you tell us a bit about yourself and Supply Chain Wise?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to come along and speak with you today about supply chain, something that's very close to my personal heart. So I spent 18 years of a bit of a misguided youth in the military before then getting my first real job with Amazon.com. When I was working with Amazon, I spent a lot of time, working in the fulfillment centers, driving new buildings, and creating new lines of production for the business. But then I left Amazon and moved to Amazon Web Services. And within Amazon Web Services, I spent the best part of 5 years building the global supply chain transportation and logistics practice, which was fantastic fun. And it really did enable me to work with some of the world's largest and most exciting customers. And of course, to work with hugely innovative technology. Then in July 23, I left Amazon Web Services and we created a company called Supply Chain Wise. And Supply Chain Wise is, as they say, the seed doesn't fall far from the tree, really does help customers use AWS to enhance their supply chains. And very, very much within the AWS mold, we apply the key leadership principles around frugality and ensuring customer obsession in everything that we do.
Perfect. That's great introduction, John. Thank you so much. So, based on your experience working with various retail and CPG companies, right? What's the biggest supply chain challenges, or I would say top five supply chain challenges that you have seen in the market today?
Yeah, it's funny to sort of say five, trying to narrow it down. The one that we get asked the most is that people will say to us, they'll say, look, John, why is it I can order a screensaver for me mum and know that Amazon are going to deliver it tomorrow before 12 o'clock? But yet, as a business, I could order an entire sea containers worth of screensavers and have no idea when they're due to arrive. So really, it speaks back to the age-old supply chain challenge around visibility. And that is round about, what is going to be delivered, when, and so what. The next area, is something that you and I were speaking about over tea and coffee in preparation for this, is so many customers say, John, what I want is a better forecast. And if you think about that, supply chains have been around since, man decided to trade with man. We've been doing it for a very long time. And there's companies specialize in forecast generation that have spent billions of dollars creating models. But yet most customers are still asking for enhanced forecast, which means that despite years of investment, we still haven't solved a fundamental challenge around forecasting and demand volatility. And to me, it's because customers don't want better forecasting. They want better decisions based on data that they can trust. The next area really is about the ever-increasing complexities that we see, and you spoke to this, the ever-increasing complexities that we see in supply chain. We're seeing more and more multi-tier supply chains, and therefore it is the ability to visualize or at least orchestrate what's happening across that is an issue. The next area is that a lot of customers will spend an absolute fortune in the latest and greatest supply chain tools. Often they'll go to Gartner, they'll go to the top right quadrant, and they'll buy all of the top tools that they require. But yet they don't get the execution and responsiveness that they thought they might. So many of them still spend a huge amount of time downloading all the data onto that most famous of supply chain tools, Excel, in order to then run pivot tables on the data and create some understanding of what's happening despite the investment in technology. And in the final area, really, I've got the privilege of being a consultant, which means that for the last, almost 10 years, I've been moving between some of the world's largest organizations in virtually every industry, from high performance compute, aerospace, oil and gas, CPG, it doesn't matter, all these different industries. And therefore, really, what I see is that we need more cross pollination of ideas. We need to understand what are the lessons from all these different industries and what are the trends so that we can actually do something about it.
Amazing, amazing. That's really interesting, John. So you have touched some critical points there, right? So we will unpack each one. We'll dig into each one of these challenges, what's going on inside of these challenges, and then we will see how AWS and partners like yourself, Supply Chain Wise, are helping companies solve them. So let's start with challenge number one, which is visibility gap, which seems to be a persistent problem across industries, right? So even despite spending a lot in the ERP systems, in the warehouse management system and the TMS system, what we see is, companies are still having the visibility gaps there, right? They see it as a number one pain point. And according to Gartner report, 80% of the supply chain leaders still don't have end-to-end visibility across their supply chain operations. And if you don't have the full picture, you can't act quickly or confidently. So where does the visibility actually break down, and why are the leaders not able to spot this sooner?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you picked the Gartner statistic there, that 80% haven't got visibility. So what we have to think then is that 80% of the leaders in supply chain are not sitting around blind. They are proactively finding out what's going on.
Yeah.
So what that ultimately means is that these people are making telephone calls, WhatsApping each other, sending screenshots of Excel spreadsheets, creating PowerPoint slides that they're briefing people on. All of that activity is happening in order to try to get some visibility, because here's the challenge. If you don't know what's coming, and importantly, what state it's in, then put simply, you can't plan, you can't react, and you can't deliver with any confidence. And that deliver without confidence is actually quite important, because it translates into sales and new business. So you can have a situation where you have a customer that's saying, hey, look, I want to have this product delivered by insert date time. We're creating a new promotion, we're creating a new event. And your sales teams don't have the confidence to say, yes, we can achieve by 15th of August, because they haven't got that ability to get the visibility that they require. You then asked about breakdown. And I suppose it makes me smile a bit, because when we think about breakdown, there are so many opportunities in the supply chain for failure to occur. So whether it be at the point of manufacturer, whether it be the stakeholder, that is the shipper of record, whether it be a freight forwarder, whether it be one of the many carriers that are physically carrying the items, whether it be customs or the customs broker that you're using, the terminal operator, maybe the intermodal person that's coordinating between truck to ship to rail to air,
Yeah.
or it could even be your own distribution centers, or worse, third-party logistics sites that you're also using. So all of that can result in these data silos. And those data silos, like you mentioned, are things like the ERP systems, the transportation management systems, and the warehouse management
Yeah.
systems. One view.
Yeah.
But imagine that every single one of those stakeholders that I just mentioned, they all have their own ERP, transportation management system, warehouse management system, which ultimately means these data silos are multiplied by many times across the entire supply chain. So it's little wonder that there's no visibility across the supply chain, because it is ultimately very complex.
Yeah, definitely, right. You mentioned around the multiple versions of ERP, the disconnected systems, and particularly the data silos, and this quite resonates with what I see in the field today as well, right? So, what's the cost of making decisions on the data which you only half trust?
Yeah, so I love the notion of sort of only half trust. It's a bit like the notion that if you don't trust the number, then you either spend a huge amount of time trying to learn what the true number is, or you ultimately go with a gut reaction or a gut instinct, which is kind of okay as well. But either way, you can't half trust something that you either do or don't. And if you don't, then all of your decisions are going to be based on a much slower basis, because you're going to spend time verifying it. And you don't have to look very far. So let's take, I mean, we've worked in global manufacturers together, for many years. If you think about a large global manufacturer, they could have an SAP instance, and there are other ERP systems, but I'm just using SAP for ease. They could have an instance in Europe. They could have another instance in America. They could have instances by business units. And that could ultimately mean the same product could be called different things. So, for instance, you could have a brake caliper that is known as 123 Alpha in Europe, 5678 X ray in the US, caliper brake red in Asia, and maybe even just known by the packaging number in Latin America. So, then you say, okay, but that brake caliper has come from a tier one and a tier two and a tier three supplier. And all of those organizations have different names, different numbers, different codifications for either the component parts of the brake caliper or the actual brake caliper itself, depending upon the route. And that's before you take into account the naming conventions being used by maybe customs or the naming convention being used by your freight forwarder or your shipper of record. So ultimately, it just gets worse and worse, and the data silos become harder and harder.
Right, right. So, in your experience, when you start engaging with these companies, right? So, what's the clearest red flag, I would say, which helps you understand that yes, there is a visibility gap here?
Yeah, I love those sorts of vibes that you pick up with customers. And for me, one of the fastest ones is when a customer says, "I have no visibility problem." Because it immediately makes me, very suspicious.
Yeah.
Because I don't mind whether you are the world's largest aerospace company or whether you're the world's smallest manufacturer of training shoes. You will have a visibility gap across your supply chain somewhere, and the fact that people say I don't have one indicates to me very loudly that they haven't considered what visibility truly means to their business. But it's okay to say that as a sort of a bit of a tongue in cheek. The truth is, most companies haven't really considered visibility at any level of detail. So one of the things we developed was a visibility model or a visibility framework that enables companies to kind of identify where they are on a journey. And I say a journey because getting visibility is a battle, and it's something that you never win. You're consistently fighting to sustain visibility. So for me, if we think about that model, the first level of it we refer to as the dark zone. And in the dark zone, it's all manual. If you want to know something, you phone someone. If you want to know what's happening, you WhatsApp the driver and ask them if they've stopped for a cup of coffee. You are consistently phoning, WhatsApping, texting, and emailing. The next level, and by the way, in that area, as you can well imagine, it's time consuming when customers phone you and say, "Where is my stuff?" The amount of staff effort required to find out where it is on that journey is huge. The next area, which I think is equally compelling and challenging, is where we get to milestone tracking. And I suppose milestone tracking to me is very much things like it's been shipped, it's been delivered. It's an idea of static points in time that you're trying to track against. And whilst it's better than the dark zone in the sense that you've at least got some visibility, it can also belie some of the real challenges. I'll give you an example. If we had a milestone that said the ship was due to arrive at Rotterdam, for argument's sake, if the ship is going to steam by Rotterdam, and by the way, they frequently do, and it's actually going to go to Felixstowe, then the truth is, not only is your milestone irrelevant because it's never going to be achieved, it's actually quite dangerous because you've lined up a lot of operations on that milestone being triggered in order that you will then go to the next stage. And if it's never triggered, if it never happens, there's a lot of manual activity to overcome it. The next area, which is slightly better than milestones, is when we start getting this sort of system linked visibility. And really, what we're then getting is we're getting a feed. So it could be telemetrics data from a carrier. So we now know that the truck has left our facility and we can see that it's on road towards our next facility. We might get information around traffic and so forth. And it's really quite useful. But what we tend to see is we tend to see silos of system linking. So we might get telemetrics data from the carrier, which is useful. But if it's not linked to the purchase order, we can't then say what's on the truck. But then if that's not linked to the customer experience, we can't see what customers might be affected by. For example, a road traffic challenge where the vehicle has to stop or be delayed. So system linking is good, but it still doesn't solve all the problems. The next area is what we sort of refer to as event-driven awareness. And this is where we start to take into account the implications of the various information sources that we have. So, for instance, so what if a cold chain truck starts to indicate that its refrigeration unit is no longer able to maintain the right level of temperature for the movement of the fresh produce? So, what if, like I mentioned previously, we know with 95% certainty that the ship is going to steam by a particular port of call? Those event driven awareness then helps us be able to change or indeed have direct effect upon customer orders, promotions, etc. The final area of all of that, which is really, it's kind of the end state, I suppose, but it's still part of a journey, is the control. Predictive flow control. So think about that. What we mean is from the point of manufacture to the point of use, we are able to actually seamlessly predict the implications of that flow. So, for instance, if I was working with a company that make passenger carrying aircraft and I have a tier supplier that manufacture seats, it's quite useful to know where the seats are on the journey because the position of putting the seats onto the aircraft will impact where it sits on the final assembly lines and can have significant production flow challenges. So, that ability to have prediction as a total flow is truly impactful for any manufacturer.
Perfect. And that's an amazing explanation. And thanks for touching on those different areas, right? So, how can the companies close the visibility gaps without ripping their existing system? Because that's what we hear from our customers, because they've already invested a lot and lot. What they want is solutions which can work on top of what they already have in place.
Yeah, I think like it's certainly supply chain wise, and I know Amazon Web Services are exactly the same in this. One of the key leadership principles is frugality. There's a lot of there's a lot of sales out there that will position a tool as if it's going to solve all your problems with a simple easy button. There is no easy button. If there was an easy button, we wouldn't even be having this conversation because you would simply have purchased tool one, hit the button, and your supply chain would be on screen in all regards, and life would be easy. Doesn't exist. So that means then that even if you just had spare cash and you just wanted to throw it at the problem, it's not necessarily going to solve it by just simply ripping out existing systems. So, what I would urge any of our mutual customers to do is not to throw away what you've done, but is instead to seek integration between the various systems. So, for instance, you might be using another AWS partner, Everstream AI, to get some risk data. You might be using another AWS partner like Forekites to get some data around shipping information, all of which can be really helpful. But if you're not bringing those two streams together, then you might be missing some aspects of the key outputs that they're giving you. So therefore, really, what it's about creating data integration opportunities so that you can then operationalize that you know. And I often say to some of my largest customers, if only you knew what you actually know, life would be a lot easier. And it's a bit tongue in cheek, but I suppose what we can do is rather than relying upon an ERP system that produces batch data every 12 hours or 24 hours to try to manage the entire flow of your supply chain, you can extract the data that is necessary, i.e., what is in inventory, what are the current customer demand signals, etc. You can then enrich that with information around traffic flow, logistics flow, production targets at distribution centers, constraints with carrier, whatever. You can enrich it with all of that information to come up with the real time, or more accurately, near real time management of your operation. So the trick is not to throw away that you have. The trick is to make sure that you can extract data from and write data back to those systems that you are investing in. So that means that it's important that the systems that you're investing in are modern, are API enabled, are preferably on a cloud environment, which therefore by default will be modern and API enabled, and therefore link the information that is flowing from them. The other area that you mentioned in there, which is, how do you sort of move forward? But the way that you move forward really is by conducting small targeted proofs of concept in those key areas. And I suppose the one thing that I would throw out there, and it's a bit of a paradox, but is what it is, the more visibility tools that you have, the more fragmented the sort of situation becomes. So unless you're actually able to bring it into one common data platform with one common naming convention with one common set of business logics, it actually gets harder. And that can be everything from cold chain logistics, where is my vehicle? What is the state of my fridge? To what are the outcomes of my perishable goods? To what is the facility availability to store those perishable goods on arrival, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things need to come into one platform, not be siloed and not be communicating individually. Otherwise, we're going to be using Excel and bringing it together manually.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Okay, so let's move to the challenge two, which is demand forecasting, right? Which is around predicting and preparing for sudden changes. So, in retail and CPG, what we see is even a social media trend can double the demand overnight. And when we speak about the critical industries like aerospace, a small change in the order can disrupt the production schedule for months. But yet, McKinsey found that only 6% of the companies are very satisfied with their forecasting accuracy. The rest are either firefighting or overproducing, and both of which cost money. So, what's the most common forecasting trap even these sophisticated companies fall into?
Yeah. So I mean, again, I love, but I'm equally frustrated by those sorts of statistics. When you hear that only 6% of companies are actually satisfied with what they've got, I'd love to know what they're actually satisfied with, because clearly that's something that would be scalable. Because it's shocking to think that 74% of customers are not satisfied with their forecast. And I suppose, like we talked about a little bit earlier, most customers don't want a better forecast. They don't want better demand planning. Really what they want is they want better data that they can trust to make decisions on. So let's maybe unpack some of that. So for me, when you talk about traps, I think there are probably two. There are lots, but let's focus on maybe two. So the first one is that there is an over reliance on historical data. And this is you see this a lot, especially in fashion and in other areas where it's seen as a sort of a continuous trend. Where maybe last year in October, little black dresses were selling, and therefore the expectation is this coming October we're going to sell similar or same numbers. But of course, that assumption, doesn't take into account the fact that the world's changed. It doesn't take into account current trends or current exchanges that are happening on social media platforms, and we'll talk about that in a second. So ultimately, history is a good predictor of some things, but is over reliance upon it is likely to result in failure. And that over reliance, it can also be undermined if you are, for example, a high fashion brand that really doesn't sell a large quantity of items. Your ability to sort of rely upon that historical numbers really becomes even more suspect. The next area, which I think is very common, is that all too often, especially in the largest organizations in the world, it's frequently too centralized forecasting, meaning a head office somewhere generates the number 42, and ideally they say 42.42227, and they come up with this number, and then they issue it out to all of the various countries and markets. Those markets issue it down to the regions issue it down to the store. And you just know because we all do it, that there are two human beings that go out for a cup of coffee somewhere from one of these regional offices and think, what does that number even mean? It's pointless. And that is because all too often the nuance is at the market level, or it's at the store level, or dare I say it, it could even be at the block level within a large metropolitan area where the demand fluctuations and the trends and the desires are fundamentally different, of course, depending upon what we're trying to sell. So, more often than not, centralization to that extreme can undermine also the trust. What do the head office know about insert whatever it is that you're trying to forecast? Yeah, it's funny because when we were talking about that sort of, those two traps, this idea of over reliance and too centralized, and you mentioned about sophisticated businesses. So I suppose it's almost an irony of this. is that the more sophisticated the business, actually, the more likely you are to make the mistake, to fall into the trap of relying upon historical data and also maybe centralizing your forecast. And this is where AWS really does step in and make a significant difference, because with advanced models, whether that be a SageMaker tool or maybe even AWS Forecast, whatever you're using, those models will identify variables that are contributing to successful forecasting and disregard those variables that are not. So as a result, you can actually throw large numbers of variables at the model, and the model will identify those that are having a statistically significant effect. So I suppose from that perspective, AWS has a clear role in helping improve accuracy. The other thing that I think really does come out to this, and you mentioned this, is that customers frequently confuse precision with accuracy. So just because they get the 42 point number doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So the test that we must always ask ourselves with any forecast really falls into two, maybe three questions. The first question is, does the forecast actually improve the decision making? So we've got the number. Are we improving decision making based on that number? Yes or no? And it's not maybe, could be. It is a very clear cut yes or no. Then I suppose the next thing is, does the number or does the outcome of the forecast actually tell planners what to do? So 42, so what? Increase production, decrease production. If it doesn't give any indication as to what the outcomes need to be, then it's equally not that useful. And I suppose the final test would be having assured that it supports decision making and having assured that it gives planners decision support. Is it actually driving any enhancement to revenue, customer performance, net promoter score, etc.? So if I give you an example of that, we could be using, say, AWS Kinesis to take a feed from point of sale and then using that feed from point of sale to test the model accuracy around predicted demand versus actual demand in order to provide a continuous feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about forecasting, then I suppose if I can sum it up in this way, is that forecasting, it isn't about being perfect. I suppose it's about being less wrong, but faster. So it's not about perfection. It's about being less wrong, but faster.
Perfect. And I really love that phrase, less wrong, faster. And that's a very smart way to think about it. And I think that's a practical approach one should take, right? So we spoke about the importance of the forecasting and around the accuracy and all. So what's the impact when forecast is wrong, even by a small margin?
So, I mean, look, I mean, forecasting is used. It depends on what. So, for instance, a 5% inaccuracy in forecasting that's being used for labor planning could result in either an overuse of overtime, increasing variable cost of production. It could result in you overhiring, resulting in an increased fixed cost for a period of time. Those are sort of, maybe two or three levels down. But the one that always comes to mind's eye when we think about forecasting and accuracy is really a conversation that we were having with one of the world's largest healthcare companies. And this company was working with AWS in order to enhance forecasting. And what we did is we brokered a conversation between the healthcare company and Amazon.com, because we knew that the company sells a large quantity of products over Amazon.com. So we worked with the Amazon.com retail team in order to understand why this particular company, its confirmation rate was sitting at circa 60%. Now, whilst it's not true to say that if they had a confirmation rate of 100%, that they would have sold all products via Amazon, but it is to say that of the 40% that they weren't providing into Amazon.com, there was a opportunity missed in terms of sales.
Yeah.
And when we were speaking to the team, we identified that a 1% improvement in that confirmation rate actually translates into double-digit millions of pounds sterling
Yeah.
missed potential sales. So then when you ask about what happens when it goes wrong, it's millions of pounds is what happens when it goes wrong.
Definitely, that sounds costly, and overhiring, increasing fixed cost, missed lost opportunities. So, what technologies can make these forecasting more adaptive and resilient?
So okay, so technologies. Let's pick up. Interestingly, let's pick up that healthcare example again because it's not always so easy when it comes to technology, and I think sometimes we get blinded that math fixes all the world's problems. This particular company, when we started speaking to them, we started to identify that okay, there were additional and more advanced tooling that they could use, and we were helping position that there. But as we were talking to the senior leadership team, we started to then be given permission to go and break into the data science team and then the particular team that was dealing with Amazon, etc. And as we started to work through all those different layers, it suddenly became clear to us that the healthcare company was not taking into account any of the data being provided from Amazon.com. And the senior leadership team, ultimately refused to sort of accept that that's true until, ultimately we sat down with them and brokered the conversation, and it became clear that that data wasn't being used for a whole bunch of different reasons, but it wasn't being used. So that then enables us to think, okay, how can we enrich your omni-channel distribution? So now we step away from Amazon.com and we become Amazon Web Services again, and we start speaking purely about omni-channel distribution, of which one was Amazon, others were fixed retail stores, and others were competitors to Amazon. So now the conversation is how do we get the right volume to the right channel?
Yep.
And actually, that in itself then requires the use of enriching tools such as Amazon Data Exchange that enables us to bring in a whole bunch of external data sources so that we can start looking at things like footfall over their stores. We can look at weather, we can look at seasonality in markets, we can pull information around national holidays, sporting, the wealth of data that's out there. We can bring it all in, and then we can use that to start to create a picture over when is it best to send volume to Amazon, when is it best to send volume to bricks and mortar, when is it best to send volume to competitors off Amazon. And then we're able to create a very common picture for them so that their forecast accuracy was less important than the decisions that they were taking with the data,
Yeah.
which they increasingly trusted.
Definitely, definitely, yeah. Okay, so let's move to the challenge 3, which we discussed, which is multi-tier supplier complexity. And most companies, they know their tier 1 supplier or the direct supplier very well, right? But research shows that less than 50% have visibility beyond tier 2, where the significant risk lies actually. For example, let's take like a major retailer might be working closely with their beverage supplier, but the supplier's packaging manufacturer might have got some risks. Let's say a shortage of raw materials like as plastics for bottles, right? And these kind of risks can lead to empty shelves, it can disappoint the customers and eventually lead to loss of sales. But despite this, why are most of the companies still underestimating tier 2 and tier 3 risk?
I mean, I suppose that there's a very human element to this, and the human element really is I've got a good relationship with insert my 1,000 tier 1 suppliers. I've built trust with them over the years. I've got relationship managers that are working with them, and even in a much smaller scale, I could have 100 tier 1 suppliers that I'm working with and know them by name. You might even see them physically. So there's a very human aspect to the relationship. But then there's also a commercial angle to some of the challenge with getting behind tier 1. And that commercial relationship really is also quite human. Why would a tier 1 supplier that is dependent upon a tier 2 to manufacture a particular widget expose who they are, what price they're paying, because the fear, and maybe it's a legitimate fear, but the fear would be that the end organization would reach around a tier 1 and simply have a direct commercial relationship with a tier 2 or tier 3 in order to get a better price or to enhance
Yeah.
visibility. So there's a real human angle to it. The other aspect of it, which I think is clear, is that the ripple effect, and you mentioned this briefly, but the ripple effect of a tier 2 or tier 3 failing can impact $1 billion value chain. And most of the risk, I can't get you a figure to qualify, but I'm gonna have to dig into it and come back to you with it. But if we think about most of the risk, the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers tend to be smaller, and they tend to be critical in the provision of certain nodes. So the smaller they are, the more vulnerable they are to, a flood, to a fire, to a financial pressure. And therefore, actually, in many ways, your tier three, tier two, tier three vendors are probably also your biggest risk.
Yeah.
So if you're not visualizing what's happening with tier two, tier three, then you're kind of using hope as a strategy that the problem doesn't come and hurt you.
Yeah.
So really, it is critical that we seek to fight for information in tier two, tier three.
Yeah.
But that's a conversation around data availability.
Yeah, exactly. So, given these hidden risks, and also from security and compliance perspective, right? So, it creates an interesting challenge in terms of data sharing and trust boundaries. So, how do companies start building trust and data sharing with these suppliers further down the chain?
Yeah, I mean, it's an age-old problem, and it's not just technology. And I do think that Amazon Web Services actually has a very, very significant role to play in this. I'll come back to that in a second. So the first and most important aspect of all of this is building trust and relationships. And I suppose if what you do in the market, if all you're doing is walking around with a big compliance stick and treating all of your end tier suppliers as nothing more than transactional relationships, and you show no interest in their business, and you show no desire to support their business, and you show no desire to collaborate in the supply chain, then all you're ever going to have is a very transactional relationship, and it's also going to be fickle.
Yeah.
And no matter how big you are in the supply chain, I mean, Amazon is a big organization, but Amazon.com does not and cannot afford to walk around the market wielding some big stick demanding that everybody moves out of its way, because it is only a customer of insert whomever who you want. It's a customer of Maersk, it's a customer of Eddie Stobart here in the UK. It's a customer of some of the large CPG and FMCG organizations. So from that perspective, it still has to collaborate. So we need to create an environment where instead of it being transactional, we seek to create strategic relationship across our supply chain. We change the narrative from being you have failed to comply with to we understand that you haven't achieved these particular metrics. How can we help you? What is the challenge?
Yeah.
And what we don't want to do is we don't want to pass for even just take cash flow risk. We don't want to pass a cash flow risk just ever increasingly down the chain,
Yeah.
so to the point where your tier two, tier three suppliers fall over. And that can be something really silly like inventory holdings. I don't know how many vehicles I'm going to produce next month. So you hold all the precious metals for the catalytic converters at your financial risk. We need to have a much more mature conversation across that spectrum. Now, I mentioned that I think AWS in particular has a crucial role to play here. It can be quite challenging to have a neutral party, especially in a commercial context. It can be really challenging to have a sort of neutral party. And I think AWS can play that role because it has done so very successfully with organizations that are competitors, but yet still use the same platform. So by creating, and we know that Amazon Web Services is all about security as job zero. So we know security is a given.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's about trust. AWS is a large business and therefore is trusted from a commercial perspective. It has a brand and reputation of trust. It's already invested in many of the organizations that are in the supply chain. So the account teams across AWS land, if you're listening, the account teams across AWS land can truly help bring all of these organizations together and create an ability to share information pertinent left and right of the supply chain. Now, when we talk about sharing information, and we talk about security in particular, we can have a pool of data. And because of the tooling within AWS, we can actually share pertinent information with named tier suppliers. And the information can change depending upon the level of trust that we allocate to those suppliers. So that ultimately means that you can actually codify trust and you can bring people into a common operational picture and you can actually award ever increasing levels of trust depending how long you've been working with them. And most importantly, as Jeff once said, good intentions don't work. So if a good intention is to ensure that data sharing is switched off when someone is no longer an end-tier supplier with your organization, it won't work. So therefore, actually re-engineering the environment that says when we no longer have a procurement relationship or contractual relationship with that customer, they are automatically removed from the data sharing.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
instantaneous, it's codified, and it's logical.
Right, right. And have you seen examples where this kind of supplier data sharing has changed the outcome completely or actually made a real difference?
So the answer is yes in many different areas. So when we think about say automotive is a great example of this. They have a just on time mentality. They are dealing with like everyone, but they have been dealing with very significant shocks across the operating environment, whether it be governments losing their nerve and changing rules around EV integration, whether it be consumer demand signals, whether it be just the sheer financial pressure that the world is under. So they've had huge shocks rippling through the automotive industry, and those shocks do, reverberate across the tier two to tier three and beyond supply base. So inside that environment, we're working with one global manufacturer in Germany to create a industrial cloud, for want of a better expression, and that industrial cloud is designed to facilitate sharing of production so that we know how many of a particular type of vehicle are going to be manufactured in quantity. We can see changes to the production schedule. We can see how the plant is intending to retool. And that enables everyone within the organization to just adjust their
Wow.
metrics and their plan a little bit just to get that increased precision so that ultimately they're accurate when they deliver what is required. So, yes, there are some good examples, but often that's a big example and it's made a huge difference. But often companies start with but how do we get moving?
Yeah.
So again, I would urge anyone, customer, AWS account team, anyone in that environment to not try to boil the ocean, but instead say, okay, look, could we run a pilot between one company and a named supplier? And it could be something really simple. We're going to create a dashboard so that you can see what they can see
Yeah.
as agreed and put it between the two and start to see how that building of trust enables enhanced flow. So we're doing it right now, actually. We have a carrier that works with Amazon.com. The carrier is held to account for what's known as DEA, delivery estimated accuracy. At the moment, the carrier has no visibility over the DEA performance that Amazon sees until it gets to its quarterly meeting,
Wow.
right? Which
Yeah.
is kind of interesting because the carrier provides Amazon with all the data.
Mm.
Amazon then applies its mathematical equations to that data and then gives the carrier a performance score based on that data. So what we're doing is working with Amazon and working with the carrier is we're creating a tool that enables the carrier to have a minute by minute view of what their DEA performance is in order that they can actually enhance DEA performance, which is in the mutual interest of the carrier because Amazon likes carriers that perform well. And it's in the mutual interest of Amazon because, of course, now you've got a carrier that is proactively driving enhancement to performance on a metric that Amazon considers critical to its operation. So, very simple example, but it's a really easy POC to set up and execute against.
Definitely. Yeah. Amazing. Okay, so let's move to the fourth challenge, which is execution and responsiveness, right? So even the best plan can face disruption. So, and there can be multiple reasons. It can be due to weather events, it can be due to regulatory changes, equipment failures, and so on. But the question is how quickly you detect, decide, and then act, right? So, according to BCG, leaders who respond within hours, not days, they see up to 30% lower disruption cost. So, what's the moment you can say that the supply chain has moved from reactive to proactive?
Okay, so it's interesting about the sort of reactive, proactive, and so forth. And again, a bit like the model that we set out for visibility, we have to see this supply chain in a bit of a continuum. So in the early stages of a supply chain, what we have is a situation where you're going to be making most telephone calls, you're going to be doing most of your work in Excel, you're going to be quite slow and unresponsive. Moving away from that, and you're going to be mostly on-prem, by the way, from a technology perspective, and you're going to have all sorts of security issues. Moving away from that area, you're going to move into another space where you've started to identify that you've got these problems.
Yeah.
And what you're going to do, you're going to go to the top right quadrant of Gartner if you can afford it. And if you can't, you're going to go somewhere along that spectrum. And you're going to start investing substantial sums of money in these supply chain solutions. Quite often, what people will do is that they will go and try to purchase something like maybe an SAP platform and call it a supply chain solution across the entire operation. So this is what goes on in that environment. But despite spending all of that money, you can't be reactive. You can't be proactive because no one of those systems that you've just purchased actually solves the end-to-end problem. What you end up doing is you end up downloading all the data into our old friend Excel, running your pivot tables on it,
Yeah.
and then generating answers according to that.
Yeah.
So when you ask about how do you get into that sort of reactive and responsiveness, it's recognizing that a bit like the grief curve, you are where you are today, meaning you know using a lot of Excel and so forth. You've transitioned to this environment where you're purchasing best of breed capabilities, but not getting the outcomes that you want. So then you have to punch through to this third area, which is autonomous.
Mm.
And that's where Amazon very firmly is. And in this autonomous supply chain, a lot of the day to day decisions that would be taken would be fully automated. And that is what frees up the cognitive capacity of the supply chain team
Yeah.
to be able to think through the problems that they're facing and to be able to think strategically, not thinking about the minute by minute problems.
Yeah.
The area beyond that, automation, would be full integration, where a huge number of your decisions would be taken without any human interaction.
Yeah.
Can I give you an example?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So imagine, for instance, that you run a large fulfillment center and therefore you use a lot of corrugate in order to be able to generate boxes. So in a early model, what would happen is that as we get towards Christmas, all of my team would start reaching out to corrugate manufacturers and put in demand signals. So too would every single warehouse in the world. So suddenly the corrugate manufacturers would struggle and start to fall over because it is an unrealistic demand signal.
Mm.
If I was in the middle group where I have advanced demand planning capabilities, I might have downloaded it onto Excel and been able to provide several weeks in advance a steady flow of the corrugate that I'm likely to require. If I was in a automated system, then I would be sending automated output.
Mm.
But if I was in a fully integrated system,
Yeah.
then I wouldn't have to do any of that. I would just simply say to the corrugate manufacturer, maintain that stock level in my facility at all times.
Mm.
And I would be sharing seamlessly the data. It could be as much as using computer vision to actually see exactly how many boxes are in the inbound dock, how many are in the high racking, and how many are currently in use. And you would provide that level of transparency because you don't want to have to deal with it anymore. And it becomes a very integrated and fully automated system. So a simple example, but you can see how if you fight to get that degree of integration, you can actually achieve a very effective execution across your supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So I think you mentioned around automation a couple of times, and I think it's really important to reduce the response time, right? So in terms of the if any kind of disruption occurs, right? So with that, I would come to the another question on when a disruption hits, right? What's the first question you ask?
Yeah, so it's interesting, So when the classic examples of this was COVID, of course, but let's not go back over old examples. We've got many fantastic examples. Then we think about the modern world and we say, well, surely we must have some current examples. Well, okay, so let's look at this retailer we were working with. So this retailer, they were about to do a production run, and it was based on the fact that they had inventory that was just about to come out of customs clearance and move into their operation. Now, they were milestone tracking for visibility back to our previous example, and therefore had assumed that that volume had cleared customs. The truth was the Red Sea crisis was in full swing. So we had people firing rockets at commercial vessels, and therefore there was significant, like 12-week significant delay on the arrival of volume.
Mm.
So the ETA had not been met because the ship had been rerouted as a result of challenges in the Red Sea. The volume was still at sea, and therefore the production that was just about to start was immediately disrupted. So the first question you've got to try to understand is okay, there has been a disruption. So what? So what? So what?
Mm.
And nearly always my first inclination is to look at customer impact to understand what is the customer facing challenge we're about to experience.
Yeah.
If we don't have automation based in that, and in this particular example
Yeah.
we didn't, then you're into the next challenge, which is effectively how are we going to recover from? Can we delay the promotion? What is the cost of wait?
Yeah.
And working through those issues. When we were working within Amazon and we had disruption impact, because we had a huge number of automated systems, we were actually able to focus on the bigger level
Yeah.
questions. Let me give you an example from Amazon perspective. We had a contractor actually cut through an electrical cable into one of the fulfillment centers, which of course results in a loss of power. And if you were anywhere else but Amazon, you may be worried about the customer impact, etc. But because we have a systematic way of addressing that, yes, there will be customers that will miss orders, but we were able to level load out to the other fulfillment centers so that we could maintain promise where possible. It meant that the business was able to focus on the associates,
Yeah.
right? So it was let's get everyone evacuated from the building
Mm.
safely. Let's make sure that everyone is accounted for. Let's make sure that everyone has got the hot cup of tea and all of these nice things that we do to make sure we're looking after our people. That was a priority for the site leadership. The level above the site leadership now had this problem where digitally the volume is being moved to other fulfillment centers to be able to continue the operation. So the so what questions they're then asking is it sustainable? How long is that site out for? What are the level loading implications? What do I need to do differently? It's a
Yeah.
fundamentally different challenge from having to deal with all of those problems in one go.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, so let's move to the fifth challenge, which is cross-industry lessons and future trends. So, what's exciting about supply chain is the cross pollination of ideas across industries, right? So, for example, practices born in aerospace, they're helping retail, and AI from FMCG is making its way into defense, right? And with generative AI, the pace of learning is multiplying very quickly, right? So, what's one practice from aerospace which you suggest, for the retail and CPG companies that they can adopt tomorrow?
So adopt tomorrow is good. So a lot of aerospace customers are very engineering centric and have a very engineering way of viewing both their product and the way in which they manufacture their product. They are often using different versions of lean, meaning very clear delineation around how the product is produced, and they apply those same engineering principles to their supply chain, to their
Yeah,
logistics, to their customer handling, etc.
yeah,
So one of the immediate lessons that anyone, especially some of these really cool startups in the retail space, some fantastic AWS customers that are just fundamentally changing the way retail is done. One of the things that we could learn from is the ability to create an engineered environment within which our products are being, manufactured, in which they're being brought to market, and in which they're being then sold, and having that sort of firm, sort of mechanisms around them, so that you can then test and adjust deliberately, rather than creating, sort of continuous experiments with no rigor.
mm,
The other aspect is to do with end-tier supplier integration and get to know your suppliers. So we know, for instance, that legislative changes within the EU, for example, mean that companies are
yeah,
required to have clear understanding right down to the lowest level as to what's happening in their supply chain. And that can mean, for instance, engineering out of your supply chain, modern slavery. It could mean engineering into your supply chain, green technology and green solutions. If you think about fast fashion, it's really tough,
yeah,
especially to maintain the price point. And if you think about something like trying to track and trace, an item from cotton seed to cocktail dress, a cocktail dress itself, it comprises of not just cotton, but many different types of fabric, many different types of material from many different countries, all being continuously brought into many different factories in order to create the next level of production. So that ability to really delve into your supply chain and understand how
yeah.
volume flows would be another lesson, especially with the legislative changes.
Definitely, that makes perfect sense because industries like aerospace, they can't afford surprises. So they have had to master this upstream visibility, right? So where will AI and orchestration make the biggest impact in the next 5 years?
So I love the question, and I like this the smile on your face when you ask it, because I think a lot of people have grown somewhat skeptical about AI and all of these terms that we hear being thrown around, because suddenly when you look in the marketplace, every company is now .ai something, and everybody has found some way of solving, the problem that no one has solved in the last, 300 years,
Mm.
and done so with this very easy button, just press here, pay me a fortune, and life's good. In supply chain, we have been using artificial intelligence for years. Okay, so and when we think about AI, we're thinking about, in my mind's eye, and you're much closer to the technology than I am. I'm thinking about those systems that are designed to replicate human intelligence, meaning it's actually a catch-all word for things like machine learning, deep learning, and so forth. So when you take a sort of an overview of AI, we've been using machine learning for years to enhance route planning, to enhance forecasting for products.
Mm.
We have been using deep learning technologies for computer vision to improve quality control, to improve customer experience, and so forth. And we now see this technology with agentic AI coming into the market. And I suppose what I would like to see is that I would like to see more agentic AI interfaces with the complexity of tools that we have. So inside supply chain wise, the areas that we're focused on is very firmly around that ability to be able to create agents that will actually orchestrate and handle complex workloads
Mm.
on behalf of the customer.
Yeah.
So what excites me, we're not there yet, but it excites me, is the ability to invite an agent that is responsible for any one of the things we've been talking about, but let's talk about visibility. An AI agent that is responsible for visibility, that joins me on my team calls, that
Well,
joins me in my Slack channel, that is there to ask questions off natively, rather than having to log into another tool with another password in order to find out what's going on. So I can see significant strength there.
mm-hmm.
The next thing that would be very cool to get towards would be the ability of customers' AI agents
Yeah.
to then communicate to each other so that we can actually create very complex orchestration.
Mm.
We see that in the early stages at the moment with things like virtual PAs that will do a diary sync that takes into account working hours and busyness and so forth. But imagine the similar ability, but with more complexity, to be able to start trying to sync how organizations are going to smooth production with supplier availability and so forth. So I think that's where we see future trends going. And what I would urge people to do is, be super skeptical, yes, be super open to these trends, yes, and trust a large hyperscaler that you are comfortable with, like AWS, to work with and partner with, and don't see it as a don't view it immediately as a sort of transactional relationship. Do try to get the most out of it, and use organizations like that to validate what you're being told. So if you've got a startup that comes in and says, "Oh, I fixed all this problem, click here and it's all done, £10,000 a month," speak to your solution architects, speak to the AWS team, and get an umbrella around it so that you can experiment with the startup in a controlled environment. And if it is all that it's claimed to be, then use the AWS team to help scale that across your operation. And of course, the same is true if you're working with one of the Gartner top right quadrant organizations. Again, speak to the team, understand how it can be used, understand how you can deploy it, and understand whether there's any incentives to be able to use it to enhance your supply chain.
Cool. Yeah. So, in your experience, what's the hardest supply chain lesson you have seen being learned too late? I mean, the kind of insight which you think the companies should have understood sooner.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it goes back to, like I mentioned previously, you have so many years of human supply chains, and you have got so many billions of dollars that have been invested in solving all of these supply chain problems. I'm always left scratching my head of why we haven't fixed digitally the supply chain with the big easy button that just fixes it, right? So when we then reflect upon the sort of the so what's behind that, and you ask about what is the common problem that we make, the common problem that a lot of people will make is that they will go blindly to the market and they will purchase off the shelf solutions, which, by the way, many of them are very, very competent. They will purchase off the shelf solutions, and then they will find it hard to make their operational process mold to the way the solution works. Basic examples. If you purchase a transportation management system that calls something a distribution node rather than a fulfillment center or whatever, and it functions slightly different from the way you operate, you either have to change your operation to suit the tool, or you have to fudge the data going into the tool. And fudging data means that you end up actually undermining the tool's inbuilt algorithms and understanding of the
Yeah.
world. And a lot of companies do that.
Mm.
They spend a lot of money, they buy fantastic pieces of kit, and then they fudge the data that they put into the tool because it doesn't quite fit their worldview.
Yeah.
And as people say, the truth is prickly, it's uncomfortable, and it's hard. If we all accept that to be true, then in many ways creating a data layer first, not necessarily first, but creating a data layer
Mm.
that is able to translate your information to the tool, and then take the data from the tool into the data layer and then retranslate that back into your language and your business logic, can go a long way to helping you achieve the actual outcome that you wanted from the many millions of pounds that people are spending on these technologies.
Yeah, cool. I mean, this has been incredibly insightful, John. So, as we wrap up, one final question. So, if retail and CBG companies they want to say transform their supply chain in the next 5 years, where do you recommend them to begin?
So, I mean, clearly I'd love to say, give me a ring, but I'm not going to say that because AWS has one of the world's largest ecosystems of partners. And you've got partners that specialize in all aspects of the supply chain, whether it be demand planning, forecasting, and all sorts of fantastic areas where people are highly specialized. So, my advice would be this: reach out to your AWS account representative if you have a named account team. If you don't, then do feel free to reach out, and I will find who your AWS account manager is for you. Spend some time talking to people in who are agnostic of what tools you use, who are agnostic of how you solve the problems, but want to understand your challenges and want to understand your operational environment, and start to codify that so that when you come to market, you're coming with a clearer understanding of your requirements. At supply chain wise, we always very firmly use all of the Amazon experience that we had, because we're all ex AWS or ex Amazon. So that means that by default, we always start with a working backwards process. And for those that are not familiar with the working backwards process, what I mean is, who is your customer? And what do they want from you? And what does your supply chain need to deliver in order to enhance their experience? We want to know that first, because it's only by understanding that can we then work backwards to actually create the supply chain and the data flows necessary to enhance that customer experience. The final thing I would say, don't go it alone. So there are some really cool programs out there, and I love, for example, the migration acceleration program.
Mm.
If I could do one thing in AWS, if I was Andy Jassy for the day, I would change it to the modernization acceleration program in a heartbeat. Because really what you have is you've got this fantastic program that has got solution architects, engagement managers, partner, it's got everything around it, and it's all geared around one thing, which is de-risking your first step into the cloud. So if you are looking at starting a digital transformation, find a strategic partner that you trust, work with a company that is going to try to understand what your customer requirements are, understand what programs are available external to you to help support your digital transformation. Don't do it alone. And then take a tentative first step and see where it goes. When you're thinking about time, you said 5 years. If you're looking at an ERP integration, yes, 4 to 5 years. If you're looking at an application, 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
If you're looking at something that is a differentiating capability in your industry right now, less than 12 months.
Yeah.
And if someone is out there selling you something that is a 2 year journey to enhance, visibility or something, then you need to come back and have a detailed conversation with a neutral party about exactly what they're telling you. Last thing, Traditional consulting and the notion that someone's going to pitch up and produce a beautiful PowerPoint presentation and a big document that's going to tell you how to do your job better by interviewing all your staff and putting it into that document and giving it back to you. I would suggest that really what you want to be asking any of these consulting organizations, what technology are you leaving behind? What technology are you testing whilst you're doing this work? And how are you going to prove via pilots, via proof of concepts, exactly how you're going to enhance? Because the last thing you want, and we hear it all too often, is we've had one of the big four come in and do a strategic survey. We didn't understand what it meant. We had another one come in and do it again, and it said more or less the same things. And now we've got another partner coming in to tell us how to implement it. I mean, come on. That model surely has got to have been left behind 10 years ago.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today, John. And to the viewers, thanks for watching the episode of AWS for Retail and CPG. I hope this conversation has given some practical insights which you can take back to your own supply chain challenges. We look forward to bringing you more episodes and insights to transform the retail and CPG businesses with AWS and our partner ecosystem.